Uh, okay, let's start this session today, please, guys. We're very lucky to have Richard Silverstein, the author of Tikkun Olam blog, to talk to us on a range of subjects that are of high interest in Israel and Israel, United States, and Israel and Jews. This title card has a graphic that might be of interesting. That's from Richard's Tikkun Olam blog about a week and a half ago. But more important, there's a link here which Dick will put on the chat for today's blog, which will be able to enhance and expand on many of the things he's gonna say. There's two things we're going to do before we start. One is I'm going to go for a second to the Cummings. And what we have is in 3 weeks, Jeff Cooper, who's with us right now, will talk on that occupation is terrorism. He's going to talk about his experiences working and living in Palestine during the first Intifada. 3 weeks beyond that, on June 6th, we'll have Mirzad Borouji, who is an Iranian foreign policy expert, who will be talking to us on the analysis of the Iran nuclear deal, prospects, consequences, and so on. So with that, I want to go back here, and what we have is a special bonus, and we've got a video of Tony reading, Tony Lidwinko, who's with us, and eating. Reading Peter Beinhart's piece from April 4th titled How to Oppose Violence in Israel-Palestine, highly abridged. We cut it in about half. It's still going to take 4 minutes, but it's going to have many of the ideas that Richard will be talking about in about 5 minutes. So let's just go. I'm going to stop this share and start a different share and try to do that. So here we go.
He wrote it on April the 4th, 2022, and it appears on his Substack column.
Tony, you're hardly, we can hardly hear you.
This is Tony.
The recording.
Beinhart's essay, How to Oppose Violence in Israel and Palestine. He wrote it on April the 4th, 2022, and it appears on his Substack column. It's been edited by Jeff Warner. It's 2032. Russia occupies Ukraine. Moscow has fragmented Ukrainians geographically and legally. Some Ukrainians enjoy citizenship but face structural discrimination. Many lack citizenship and live without free movement under military.
Awesome. Jeff, can you get the volume back? Maybe we'll have to read it again live.
I'm looking for the document now.
Or maybe summarize it or something.
So you're going to, Tony, you'll just read it right now.
If I can find it, yeah. I don't know whether I,
Just look up Peter Beinhart in Substack and it'll probably come up.
yeah, but then we'll miss all the edits.
I cut it in half, Richard.
Oh, okay, okay.
And I just didn't take the front half out of the back half.
Yeah, okay.
Well, if this isn't working, let's just pass on.
All right, I'll see if I can find it and read it.
Read it later.
But let me look for it, yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this share and I'm going to turn the floor over to Dick, who will introduce Richard.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
If you can't hear me, let me know. Joke, okay. Richard is originally, well, I don't know originally, but he went to UCLA. It turns out we were there at the same time. And he was the director in Los Angeles for the New Jewish Agenda, a group a little bit like ours that existed probably about, I don't know, 30 years ago or so. At UCLA, he earned a master's degree in comparative literature, and he'll fill in the details when he made the move from Los Angeles to Seattle. He's been writing and publishing the Tikkun Olam, which means repair the world, blog since 2003. And he now does a podcast, which I hope he'll tell us about. And his articles have appeared in addition to his own blog on Al Jazeera English, Jacobin Magazine, The New Arab and Middle East Eye. And I'm sure I've overlooked things, so I will turn it over to Richard, who can fill me in on any missing points from his biography, and will tell us about not only his blog, but his website and things that have appeared on YouTube and so forth. Okay, Richard.
Thanks, Dick.
I found it.
Do you want to
I
do
found it.
now?
If you want me to read it, I can. Otherwise, I'll just try and post it.
It's up to Jeff.
You think,
That's on mute.
what do you think? Do you think we should do it?
Yeah, let's do a short read.
Okay.
Okay, go, Tony. Everyone else,
Alrighty.
please mute yourself.
Yeah, and turn up your volume. How to Oppose Violence in Israel-Palestine by Peter Beinart, April the 4th, 2022. It's 2032. Russia occupies Ukraine. Moscow has fragmented Ukrainians geographically and legally. Some Ukrainians enjoy citizenship, but face structural discrimination. Many lack citizenship and live without free movement under military law. Many others have been expelled and cannot return. Suddenly, over the space of a few days, Ukrainians begin to murder Russian civilians. What would we say? This hypothetical Ukrainian attack against Russian civilians is my way of talking about last week's actual Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians. In the US, the debate about Israel-Palestine is deeply exceptionalized. That's a fancy way of saying that when we talk about Palestine-Israel, we often ignore the principles we apply to other conflicts. So let's imagine how American politicians and pundits might respond if these horrific acts of violence were occurring not in Hadra and Bnei Brak, but in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So if Ukrainians murdered Russian civilians, Americans would express revulsion, see a link between this indefensible violence and the violence of an oppressive Russian state. They might say about the Ukrainian attacks something similar to what Martin Luther King Jr. said after the long hot summer of 1967, quote, "It is incontestable and deplorable that Negroes have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. They are born of the greater crimes of the white society." Or what Robert Kennedy, who after King's death condemned, quote, "riots and the uncontrollable mob," but also spoke of, quote, "the violence of institutions." That is to say, the institutionalized injustice that leads to the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man among other men. If Ukrainians murdered Russian civilians, America's leaders would see this violence as a deplorable response to the violence inflicted upon them. They would not suggest, as American politicians and commentators routinely do about Palestinians, that the attacks stemmed from cultural pathology or incendiary textbooks. These dehumanizing arguments about Palestinians put Israelis in greater danger because preventing violence requires giving people hope that they can non-violently achieve equality and freedom. Palestinian American historian Maha Nasser observed that there is currently a debate between Palestinians, quote, "who emphasize the need to bring international pressure to bear on Israel non-violently, and who believe that, quote, Israel only understands the language of force." Her point was similar to King's. The more you block nonviolent change, the more you strengthen those who support violence. And that's what America's leaders do when they stymie Palestinian efforts to hold Israel accountable under international law. They produce despair, which in turn produces violence. King called urban riots the language of the unheard. One could say the same about the recent shootings in Israel. Israeli security officials agree, for example, Yuval Diskin, former head of the Shin Bet, who warned that among the Palestinians, there is a growing sense of anger and frustration because of the fading hopes for a real change in the situation. As a result, he predicted, quote, Palestinians will take to the streets, leading to another round of bloody violence, unquote. That analysis reflects an understanding that the vast majority of Palestinians, like the vast majority of Ukrainians and other members of the human race, have no desire to kill or be killed, but that some will turn to violence, even against civilians, when they see no other way to answer the violence inflicted on them. When America's leaders recognize this truth as well and have the courage to act on it, Israel-Palestine will become a safer place for everyone who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That's it.
Thank you, Tony. Back to you, Richard.
Thanks. It's good to be with you all. It's interesting to hear Peter Beinart, who as recently as maybe 5 or 10 years ago was a liberal Zionist, whose views really clashed with mine. But I should say that about 20 years ago, I was a liberal Zionist. You know, going back to 1967, I can remember protesting, or I should say demonstrating for Israel during the Six-Day War, the first real Jewish political event I can remember. And that's my background, come out of the Jewish community. In college, I went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. I spent 2 years studying at the Hebrew University. You know, I really come out of the Jewish community. I worked at one time as a fundraiser for a couple of Jewish federations, one in Orange County, California. And that's my background. But when I started writing my blog in 2003, as initially a liberal Zionist, I think Irving Kristol once said that a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. And I am a liberal Zionist who's been mugged by Israeli extremism. And as Israel turned farther and farther to the right from what we remember as the socialist state, the social welfare state, the kibbutz movement, and as it abandoned those policies over the last 20 or 25 years, and it turned more to ultranationalism, to sort of messianic settler fervor, and towards, I would say, really totally suppressing the lives of not just the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but the Palestinians who are citizens of the state. Israel has lost any purchase on me for sure, and on many Jews and the American Jews as well. And I have become an ardent, I don't know if ardent is the word, but a really a strong critic of Israel, of just about everything right now that Israel represents. And so that's sort of an introduction of sort of my ideological transformation. But let's talk about what's going on now. Excuse me. As you all will know, that this is the holy month of Ramadan. And right before our Ramadan began in Israel, there were 4 terrorist attacks by Palestinians inside Israel. And they were mostly lone wolf attacks by individual frustrated Palestinians who had given up hope. And we can talk more about that issue of how the violence, how this begets violence. But these were the largest number, the largest toll of death in a in terror attacks in Israel in 10 or 20 years. So it really was a shock to the Israeli system. And Israel has an exceedingly weak government now, run by Naftali Bennett, a coalition going from the far right to the far left. And he, in the midst of all of this, lost his majority when one of his Knesset members abandoned the coalition. So he basically had to show strength to cover himself from the right. The Likud, which he ousted from power, is looking over his shoulder and watching for any opportunity to probe any weaknesses. So Bennett ordered out the troops, and they swarmed the West Bank. Mass arrests, hundreds have been arrested, and while in the Palestinian terror attacks, 11 Israelis died over 3 weeks. Within 1 week, the Israelis had killed 17 Palestinians. So that is the stage from which all of this starts. And we now move into Ramadan itself. And the history of Ramadan in Jerusalem is that Palestinians, Muslims, make a pilgrimage to what they call Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located. So that's the tradition, but Israel exercises all sorts of control and incitement and violence to well, I'm not sure what the motive is, but basically to assert Israeli dominance. Now, what they're doing is they're going to the third holiest shrine of Islam, and they're basically saying, as Israeli Jews, we own this place. You don't own it. It's not yours. Even though in 1967 there was an agreement between Israel and Jordan that the Kotel would be controlled by the Jewish authorities, and the Haram al-Sharif would be controlled by the Waqf, which is the Jordanian religious authority, and they would control, and the Muslims would control the Haram al-Sharif. Well, that status quo is gone, blown up. 35,000 Jewish settlers have been escorted by the border police to Haram al-Sharif in the past year. These are not Boy Scouts. These are people who have a messianic fervor for rebuilding the temple. And to rebuild the temple, they would have to, of course, destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is sitting right where the temple used to sit. So we are talking about provocation for a holy war. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but I'm saying that the groundwork has been laid for something like that to happen. The border police escorted 750 settlers during Ramadan, during the early morning prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque. They did this, and the Muslims were outraged, and they reacted by engaging in violence. But their violence was defending the mosque from the desecration of not just the settlers, but the border police who assaulted them. They broke open the doors of the mosque. They tossed stun grenades, tear gas, and they beat up what I call the defenders of the mosque, although Israel would call them the rioters and those engaging in civil unrest, etc. But there is a war going on, a religious war going on between not just the settlers, but the Israeli state, which supports the settlers. The border police are instruments of the state. So there may be people who will say these settlers are extremists and they don't represent Israel. Well, that's nonsense, because if they were extremists, then the state would renounce them and would deny them and would arrest them and would make their organizations illegal. Instead, the settlers are welcomed into coalition governments. Their Knesset members dominate the Knesset and really set the agenda for policy and legislation and all sorts of other issues in Israeli society. So these settlers really control all the levers of power in Israel for all intents and purposes. So what I mean to say here is that Israel has no right to be on the Haram al-Sharif. The border police have no right to be there. That is a Muslim space. That is a sacred Muslim space. It's just as sacred as the Kotel is to Jews. And if we had Palestinian police at the Kotel binding and gagging worshippers at the Kotel, as happened in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there would be fury and outrage from every Jew around the world. But, and this is what my blog post is about, we have no Jewish leaders, no American Jewish leaders, not a peep from them about what's going on. They are co-opted. They are so tied to brand Israel. Their mission, their organization's mission, their salaries, their donations are all so tightly tied to support for Israel that they are morally compromised, and they cannot take a stance on this. And they're largely liberal Zionists, as Peter Beinart and I used to be. They haven't been mugged by reality, the Israeli reality yet, or maybe ever. But to our credit, we changed as the situation got worse in Israel. And the problem is that none of our Jewish leaders, none of our rabbis, with a few exceptions here and there, have sort of like realized what the reality is, and realized that we have to change our position and our moral stance towards Israel. Otherwise, we are implicated in the crimes that Israel has committed. And Israel, make no mistake about it, not just has committed war crimes, and not just is an apartheid state, as the Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, said, not just an apartheid state, but Israel is a terror state. Now, this goes a little bit back to what Beinart was talking about, except I'm going to expand upon it and go deeper into the subject. We want to talk about, not we as in everybody here, but American Jews and Israel wants to talk about Palestinians as terrorists and talk about them as animals and talk about them as murderous and violent and criminals and whatever. But the fact of the matter is that um, these Palestinian terror attacks, the four of them, killed 11 Israelis. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed in the past year, since January. Um, and the body count, if we want to look in bigger, broader terms, is for every Israeli killed by a Palestinian, 20 Palestinians are killed by Israelis. So, of course, we all empathize with suffering, with Israeli suffering. Of course, no one wants anyone on either side to be killed. But you have to examine what the facts on the ground are. And that is that Israel, with its incredible military forces and incredible weaponry and incredible methods of suppression of Palestinians, is far, far more damaging and lethal than any Palestinian could be. So that is why I have started calling Israel a terror state. That's extreme for some people. I know that it would have been a hard thing for me to talk about. When I was a liberal Zionist, I would have thought this is too extreme. But the fact of the matter is that Israeli history, going back to before the founding of the state, gives ample examples of acts of terrorism, systematic acts of terrorism by before the state was founded, by the Yishuv, and after the state was founded, all the way from then up until now. Different types of terrorism. You can talk about the Nakba, an ethnic cleansing of 1 million Palestinians. You can talk about 2014 and the war in which 2,500 Palestinians were killed and approximately 100, 150 Israelis died. These are acts of terrorism, and Israel has adopted them as state policy. So I think we have to start using terms that are as strong as this and ones that we have considered taboo in the past. I mean, as recently as 10 or 5 or 10 years ago, you couldn't have heard anybody other than on the left talk about Israel as an apartheid state. The A word was really taboo in discourse, even though some columnists in Haaretz did use the word apartheid in what they talked about. It was really taboo, but now it is totally accepted, except of course in pro-Israel apologist circles. But it's very widely accepted now, especially with these two reports that I mentioned. And we're going to be talking about International Criminal Court war crimes investigation soon. And we're going to have Israel possibly, if the ICC does go forward with the investigation, we're going to have Israel not exactly in the dock in The Hague, but potentially so. And there will be Palestinian groups that have engaged in acts of terrorism who will also, to create a balance, they probably will be included as well. But the acts of the war crimes that Israel is accused of are on a far greater scale than anything the Palestinians can be accused of. Um, Let me just look through my notes here to see where I wanted to go. Oh, I wanted to mention to you that the latest development in the rioting, I don't want to use the term rioting, the violence at Al-Aqsa is that the border police, as they invaded and desecrated Al-Aqsa, they fired rubber bullets. They're called sponge tip bullets at the worshippers. Now, sponge tip bullets are supposed to be non-lethal, but guess what? Sponge tip bullets can be as lethal as live ammunition. They have caused grievous injuries to Palestinian children, and they're not supposed to be, according to Israeli regulations, used on children. Guess what? The regulations fall away in the fog of battle, or whatever term you want to use. So this fellow, this Palestinian defender of the mosque, 21-year-old Walid al-Sharif, was mortally wounded by a headshot from a sponge tip bullet. Witnesses affirm that. His family affirms that. The border police, who have rarely been known to tell the truth about anything, say he fell and hit his head. And that is how he is now in a coma in a hospital about to die. So that's the latest. Now we have the first death. This is going to really challenge Hamas to respond, and Hamas has been restrained up until now because their Egyptian partners have urged them, lobbied and pressured them not to engage in, not to escalate the situation. And there has been very little response from Gaza to what's going on, as opposed to last year, same situation when the riots happened, and they happened, Jews engaged in pogroms against Palestinians throughout Israel, and Hamas felt incumbent upon it to defend the Palestinians that started launching rockets. And that's how last year's attack on Gaza happened, where 250 Palestinians were killed. This time that hasn't happened, but now someone is dead. All bets are off. Red lines have been crossed. I'm not predicting what's going to happen, but it will be extremely difficult for Hamas to sit back and remain silent after something like this. So Israel is the provocateur here. Israel has incited the violence. There is no way that you can justify, even for terror attacks, with the level of violence that has gone on. If, to think of a parallel, I posted a picture on my blog of 400 Palestinians were arrested in Al-Aqsa about a week ago. There's a picture of some of those 400 people, young men on their stomachs, lying on the floor of the mosque with their hands behind their backs, bound and gagged. Imagine if, as Jews, if we were in a situation where any of our great rabbis and all of their disciples, in whatever century, whatever place you want to talk about, if the authorities took any of those rabbis and their disciples and did the same thing to them that the Israeli border police are doing to Palestinians, what would our reaction be? Would we want to sit back and let our religious, our spiritual leaders be insulted and defiled and desecrated like that? I think we would understand if any of our fellow Jews rose up and engaged in violence. There is maybe this is extreme, but I think that violence is legitimate in certain circumstances, even violence against civilians. I don't think that Palestinians can pick and choose, whether they're going to attack a military base or a police base, or to attack civilians. And in their circumstances, they have to strike out where they can. The problem here is that Israel would like to blame the Palestinians, the four lone wolves who engaged in those terror attacks. But the fault lies with Israel. Israel has a history of rejectionism, a history of mass violence against Palestinians, a history of refusal to accept them as equal, having equal rights, whether national rights or political rights. Israeli rejectionism goes back decades. And no one is talking now about a Palestinian state. The two-state solution is dead. Um, but there's nothing to replace it other than a one-state solution. But Israel now has the upper hand, and Israel refuses to talk seriously about two states, and one state is absolutely verboten. So, what avenues do Palestinians have? They have no jobs. Um, um, they have no ability to build homes, new homes, if they wanted to marry and have a family. They have a bleak economic outlook, no political outlook. If you lived in Gaza, you were living in an open air prison. You can't go in, you can't go out. If it was you, or if it was your family, or if it was your own Jewish community, imagine what it would be like for you. So I'm not appealing to anybody to agree with me particularly. I'm just sort of trying to create a sense of empathy or a sense of historical context to this situation. Um, Now I'd like to move on and talk about U.S. policy, or lack of policy in most cases towards Israel-Palestine. Um, you know, we've had U.S. peace plans going back to the 1970, the Nixon administration. There was a Rogers plan. There are Camp David Accords. There was Oslo. Um, there was Jared Kushner's infamous peace plan. Obama seriously tried to negotiate a deal with Netanyahu, with John Kerry as Secretary of State. Um, it all failed because Israel is intransigent. It will not move unless it is forced to do so. And the U.S. is unwilling to use the level of force that would be, not, I don't mean military force, but the use of level of political force that would be necessary to move Israel off the dime here. It would require doing things that the U.S. is not prepared to do. It would require doing things like cutting off U.S. aid. We have that $30 billion over 10 years that Obama gave Netanyahu, hoping that he would stop his opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. Well, guess what? Israel got the 30 billion, and it still opposed the deal. So that's affirmation of Israeli policy, giving them $30 billion. We need to end military aid. We need to, if we're going to lobby and pressure Israel, we need to place sanctions upon Israel, not just economic sanctions. We need political sanctions. We need U.S. Presidents to say, "Hey, I'm not going to go to Israel until there's some movement here," and prime ministers will not be welcome here, and U.S. diplomats will not engage with their Israeli counterparts, and vice versa. We need to see Israel expelled from international bodies in the ways that we're talking about Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. We need to. There's no reason to treat Israel any differently than Putin and Ukraine, because Israel is engaging and has for much longer than Russia has engaged in invasion against Ukraine. The Israeli approach has lasted for 70 years, and it gets worse. It doesn't get better, and it doesn't stay the same. It gets worse. So, unfortunately, there are major limits to what the U.S. can and is willing to do. There's lots of reasons for that, but I wanted to sort of discuss what the U.S. policy has tried to be, and that is, most administrations realize that they cannot create a political compromise. There's no way to have a deal between Israeli Palestinians that offers Palestinians political rights, political control, sovereignty, etc. So what they have done is they've narrowed down the parameters of what they think they can do. What can they do? Two things: security, economics. So Palestinians are supposed to offer Israel security and stop terror attacks, and the Israelis are going to give the Palestinians economic benefits. They're going to improve the economy in Palestine. They're going to give 20,000 work permits, as they promised that they would do in Gaza, so that Palestinians can work in Israel. Can, by the way, be construction workers building new settlements, which is often what they're doing. Um, so um, there's a sort of buying off the Palestinians happening in this sort of situation. We give them 10, $20 billion in aid. We make sure that they have jobs. We allow a couple of more truckloads of stuff to go into Gaza, which is under blockade. And that is supposed to make buy the Palestinians off. And that's what Obama had tried to do that. And Biden tried to do that after the Gaza attack last summer. He promised that U.S. aid would flow to Gaza, and it would be economic aid, and it would make things better for Gazans. Well, if you're still under blockade and under siege, what good is whatever you try to do economically inside of Gaza? You have no ability to interact with the outside world. You can't trade. You can't do anything that a regular state can do. So that's that's the limitation of U.S. policy. Um, and we should also talk a little bit about um, what constraints limit Israeli U.S. policy towards Israel and the Israel lobby. Um, we have AIPAC, of course, which is the leading organization of the Israel lobby, but there's every other major Israeli, American Jewish organization is essentially a member of the Israel lobby, whether it's the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, all of these major groups are basically lobbyists for Israel. They don't do the lobbying quite the same as AIPAC does, but they're extensions of that. Even I would say it's going to be controversial for some of you, but I would say even J Street is perhaps the sort of arm of the Democratic Party when it comes to Israel. But J Street doesn't offer any horizon that's significant or serious either. It supports a two-state solution. It's a liberal Zionist organization. It's maybe a more benign element of the Israel lobby, but it still is trying to um, sort of launder Israel for the American public and for the Democratic Party. Um, so what that does is you have you have American Jews who are extraordinarily wealthy, billionaires in many cases, and they target the candidates that APEC wants them to or that they want to, but they're often the same thing. And we could talk about names like Sheldon Adelson, Chaim Saban, and Michael Bloomberg, Steve Wynn, Steve Ballmer used to run Microsoft, now owns a sports team, Paul Singer, Bernie Marcus. These are all names of people who have given from tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to Democrats and Republicans. And they may have other agendas because they're pro-capitalist, and so they may have social agendas as well. But one of the things they want to enforce discipline on elected officials, presidents, members of Congress, and senators, and their campaign coffers need to be filled. And these pro-Israel donors are some of the biggest factors in filling those coffers. And those donors basically, I don't know if they have to tell the candidate what to do around Israel. Often, when it comes to somebody like Sheldon Adelson with Trump, for example, he did tell Trump what to do. But the candidates are smart enough to know what they need to do. They don't need to be told. They don't need to be, put into a back room and have somebody twist their arm. They know what they have to do. They know which legislation they have to vote for and they have to pass. They know if they support legislation that is opposed by AIPAC, they know they'll have to pay a price. Now, we can talk about how that's changing a little bit. We have the squad. We have people who we have largely women of color, people who are challenging this consensus, and more power to them. I hope they go far, and I hope they're joined by many more. Um, but their power right now is limited until AOC gets elected to the Senate or beyond. Um, their power is going to be limited. I don't want to dismiss that because I think it's a very important development. And I think it angers the hell out of AIPAC that we have 8 members of Congress who won't take orders from them. And you can see that when they can, they will put up another minority candidate against them, run a primary against them when they can. This is what happened with Nina Turner, who was very involved in the Sanders campaign. They put a African American candidate who was pro-Israel up against Nina Turner, and she was defeated. They can't do that with some of the members of the squad because they have much too strong support in their constituencies. But we are being held hostage by the Israel lobby. American policy, American presidents cannot do what needs to be done in order to rein Israel in order to impose a solution that Israel will never accept unless it is forced to do so. And without that muscle, without that power, without that lobbying pressure, without some of those provisions that I talked about that are necessary, Israel is going to continue to go on its merry way and do the things that it's been doing, and perhaps even worse. I am frightened of the future. Um, if you talked about Nazi Germany in 1922 when Hitler and the Nazi Party did the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Most of them ended up in prison. They were considered fools and extremists, and that's where, by the way, Hitler rode Mein Kampf in prison. What happened 1933, 11 years later? Now, I'm not saying that the same thing will happen in Israel, but I'm saying that we're going in a similar direction. We're going in a very, very bad direction. We're going in a direction towards, well, Israel has already done ethnic cleansing. So we're going in that direction. We're going into a very bad place. So with that, I'm sorry to end on such a downbeat note, but maybe if you folks have any questions, I can be a little bit more positive and constructive.
Richard, do you want Dick or I to help you with the Q&A, or do you want to handle it?
I'm fine with it, but it's up to you since you guys are running things.
Well, we'll work together on it.
Okay, sure.
Uh, so
Somebody has their hand up. Is that Tony?
yeah, 2 of us, me and Tony.
Okay.
Why doesn't
Okay.
Tony go first?
Okay, can you hear me? Because I've got my earplugs in with
I
the.
hear you fine.
You can
I'm
hear me?
just
Okay.
raising the volume level.
Okay. Just as with the United States, if the International Criminal Court does even come out with any accusations, neither Israel nor the United States belongs to the ICC. And even if they did belong to the ICC, one of the hurdles that has to come over before the actual court itself can deliver something is there has to be a failure of the internal judicial system to condemn the crime. That certainly isn't going to happen in the United States. I doubt if it's going to happen in Israel, especially with the Supreme Court being subject to the Knesset. So, the information might get out, but where do we go from there? And then second part, it sounds like you're calling for the S in BDS.
Yeah, definitely. I support BDS. Definitely. I support any method of resistance that is legitimate, and certainly BDS is legitimate. It's nonviolent. It's basically calling for things that are totally reasonable. It's
Mhm.
calling for Israeli Palestinians to have equal rights to Jews. It's calling for the right of return. That may be controversial, but I think we can talk about the right of return in ways that are totally non-threatening and in ways that the right of return could be implemented without destroying Israel, which is
Right.
the meme that you hear from pro-Israel people about BDS. The
And
idea
the,
that
the
BDS
end
is
to
anti,
end of the end, and the end to the occupation is the third.
yeah, yeah, I think something about Jerusalem in there too. But anyway, there are three major planks, and I sometimes forget one of them. Sorry about that. Yeah, so BDS is one tool in the ongoing struggle against Israel's crimes, and a legitimate one. And I've said something even more extreme earlier, and that is, I I can no longer reject violence because of the Israeli levels of far worse violence. I don't want violence and I don't like violence, but I totally understand it in this context. Remind me of the first part of your question, um, Tony.
Oh yeah, the first part of the
Oh, the
question
ICC.
is the
Um,
ICC,
right.
because Israel
So,
and the United States don't belong to it.
right. Um, the ICC, the way I understand this is that the ICC has to make a decision about whether it's going to pursue an investigation of Israel. So far, it's decided that it has the right and jurisdiction to do so, mostly because Palestine is a signatory. Even though Israel is not, that doesn't mean that it is not subject to the
Right.
ICC because of Palestine. So um, I don't necessarily expect in the next year or two I'm going to see Bibi Netanyahu or Benny Gantz, the chief of staff in the 2014 war, which is one of the elements of the war crimes charge
Right.
before the ICC is that Gaza war. I don't necessarily expect them to see them in the dock in The Hague. I would like to see that. Um, I think the ICC is something like the BDS. It's yet another tool that we need that will expose Israel's crimes, will force the world to be more sensitive to this issue in general. It will give Israel a moral stain. It will increase its isolation and its pariah status in the world. And we need to tighten the screws, and the screws cannot be tightened, with a couple of turns of the screwdriver. This is a very long process. Um, I mean, I wish it would be a short process like the one where Soviet Union collapsed and divided up all of those uh, into independent states. Um, I wish it would be a fast process, but I don't think that it can be, barring the world waking up and the U.S. sort of getting cojones and deciding that it is going to do something. I don't really see that happening, but I think that the ICC is one tool, and I don't think that we need to see a conviction in order for that to have a really important impact.
Okay.
Dick, why don't you go next?
Uh, well, I'm kind of curious, Richard, about the war in the Ukraine. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, kind of laid the cards out on the table. He says the role of the U.S. is really to weaken Russia. He says we want to have a long-term military involvement. It has less and less to do with Ukrainians and more and more to do with U.S. antagonism towards Russia. And this seems to me to bring out a lot of contradictions, one of which is it exposes that the US can only get involved by sending clandestine trainers, CIA operatives, a lot of second line weapons, but it can't actually join the war directly. And if it did, it would probably provoke a massive reaction on the part of Russia. It also creates all kinds of inflation in the United States, which I think people react to much more than some kind of vague reaction to all the media spin about the Ukraine, and it drives Russia and China closer in what Alfred McCoy calls the modern Asian European landmass. So, what do you see happening in terms of the Ukraine and this Israel-Palestine conflict? And the law, it seems anyway. I'll just stop there.
Um, well, we need a whole separate session to talk
Yeah,
about
I
Russia and
realize that,
Ukraine.
but
But I'm not going to. I'm going to maybe go a little bit take that as at an angle, maybe not directly sort of addressing things quite the way that you phrased them. But I do think that there's a very interesting aspect of what's going on in the Ukraine in terms of Israel, um, and Israel has basically kept out of the whole thing. Israel is totally morally compromised, politically compromised, because of its close relationship with Russia, because Russia and Israel have interests in Syria. The interests conflict with each other, but they've been very careful about making sure they do not, do not engage militarily with each other. But in order for Israel to get Russian agreement for this deconfliction, Israel has to pay a price, and the price is that they have to let Putin do what he's doing in the Ukraine. And most Israelis would like Israel to support Ukraine, even though there's over 1 million Israelis who are Russian ancestry. So, and there are many Israeli Jews who are of Ukrainian ancestry as well. And the Ukraine is the heart of some very, very important Jewish communities historically. So Israel is not able to take a stance, and Naftali Bennett, went to Moscow and he visited Putin, and then he talked to Zelensky, and he said he was going to be a big international mediator. He was going to try to, end the conflict, blah, blah, blah. Well, the truth of the matter is that basically he went to Zelensky and said, Russia's offering you a really good deal, you should take it. And the Ukrainians were really pissed off about that. Another example is that Zelensky wanted to speak to the Knesset. He's spoken to the parliament in the UK, and he's spoken to the Canadian parliament, and I think he spoke to the US Congress as well. But Israel refused. They wanted him to do a Zoom. They wanted him to do it remotely, and not have it the Zoom or whatever the video feed be in the Knesset itself. They wanted the individual MKs to be in their home, and that would have dissipated the impact and not angered Putin as much. In addition, you have this issue of Israel not being willing to accept Ukrainian refugees,
other than
being
Jews.
yeah, I'm going there.
Okay.
Being willing to accept Jewish Ukrainians, but not being willing to accept non-Jewish Ukrainians. Non-Jewish Ukrainians, Ayelet Shaked, who is the Justice Minister or Interior Ministry responsible for immigration, developed this genius plan, and she said, "We will let these non-Jewish Ukrainians come into our country, but only for a 3-month visa, and they have to pay I forget, it was $3,000 deposit, and they only will get their $3,000 back when they leave after 3 months." That's the embrace that Israel is willing to offer to Ukrainians. So, um, you know, Ukraine obviously has a very tortured history in terms of Jews. There have been Ukrainian massacres during the Holocaust and Ukrainian massacres during the era of the Cossacks at the turn of the 20th century. But I do think that that Israelis, I'm sorry, really are morally on the side of Ukraine in terms of the Russian invasion. And they know Israeli Jews understand what it's like to for Jews in Europe to be under the heel of an oppressive state like Nazi Germany. So I think there's this natural affinity, but it can't be realized because Israel is really in a completely untenable position vis-a-vis Russia. Um, and you even have people like Roman Abramovich seeking refuge in Israel when sanctions were being levied against all the oligarchs. So he fled to Israel, and then when Israel got really nervous about him being there and being a pariah, all of the oligarchs being pariahs, they kindly pushed him to leave. He took a flight from Ben Gurion and he went back to Russia. Um, and a lot of the some of the yachts were going to head to Israel, but then they ended up in Turkey, where they found a safe passage. So Israel has been friendly to oligarchs for years. Russian Jewish oligarchs. There are many, many oligarchs who've sort of deposited billions of their rubles and their dollars in the Israeli economy and bought, tens of $1 million Tel Aviv penthouses and bought Israeli newspapers and all sorts of parts of the Israeli economy are now owned by these oligarchs. So Israel, it's not surprising. I mean, Israel is morally tainted in ways regarding the Palestinians, but it's also morally tainted in terms of accepting the largesse of the oligarchs. I know that didn't address you
No,
directly,
but it's
Dick, but
it was all interesting.
yeah.
Okay.
Let's go to David Mandel.
Hey, hi, Richard. Thanks for coming. Good to see you. Um, Quickly in response to what you just said now, I thought I heard that the $3,000 and leave in 3 months requirement had been modified somewhat, but I haven't followed that as closely. Maybe I'm wrong about that. The Also in response to what you just said now, I wonder whether some of the reluctance of the Israeli ruling establishment to criticize Russia has to do with the fact that they realize that they are implicated in the same kinds of activities that Russia is correctly being accused of: invasion, occupation, bombing civilians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That they're, by not criticizing, if they criticize that too much, the hypocrisy would be even more evident than it already is. But the other thing that I wanted to ask about is, this is an old debate, but I must say, I think that you're exaggerating the power of the Israel lobby in terms of setting U.S. policy, that if it weren't aligned with the interests of the U.S. ruling class establishment, of fomenting conflict, selling weapons, controlling oil, using Israel as a proxy, and as an aircraft carrier, as some people have said, that that the Israel lobby would not have the power that sometimes it seems to have. And there have been certainly a few instances historically when those two interests have conflicted, and the United States put its foot down. 1956, with the Bush and the for the elder Bush and loan guarantees, and a few other instances, et cetera. I just wanted to know what you think of all that. Thanks.
Well, yes, Ayala Chakay did withdraw that, but the reason she withdrew it was that it was so controversial and embarrassing, both outside of Israel and internally. People who were Israelis were scratching their head and saying, "What? WTF?" and things like that. So it didn't go very far. Um, as for the Israel lobby, I really wanted to focus on the Israel lobby itself. I think that I'm not disputing anything that you say in terms of the larger picture of U.S. foreign policy and the interests and that fuel our foreign policy. I was trying to sort of focus narrowly on foreign policy as it affects Israel, Palestine, and that's why I was focusing on the Israel lobby. And and so I'm not denying any of the other things you said, but my focus is pretty narrow in terms of what I think I can do best. And I think there are a lot of people, Chomsky and all these other folks who have, done the bigger picture on U.S. foreign policy, and are excellent at what they do. So I don't mean to say that the Israel lobby doesn't play a role in a broader context of ratifying these broader sort of interests of the parties that you were talking about. I think there was a third part of what you were asking, but I can't remember what it was.
I asked about the Israeli reluctance to criticize Russia because of its own culpability, and
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I agree completely about that. Um, Russia, I mean, we can talk, of course, about U.S. policy and U.S. aggression and U.S. invasions in the Middle East and all of that. But I think that that Israel sees its interests aligned with autocrats, whether they be Russia, whether they be the Middle East kleptocrats, the Saudis, the Gulf states. Israel gravitates naturally to absolute power. That's where they feel they can rely on these strongmen dictators to stand with them, stand behind them. They do not like democracies because power changes and they lose the ability to control whoever it is. And what Israel has in Russia is they have this strongman autocrat in Putin. They know that he's going to have Israel's back. Of course, Israel's going to have to give him things because he's a transactional dictator. He won't give them anything for nothing, but at least they know they can do business with him. Not in the way, hopefully, that Thatcher said about whoever it was, the Russian leader that she talked about, like, or somebody said, I saw into Putin's soul or something like that. That's not the way that Israel works. Israel
This
doesn't
was
care.
Bush
George
this time.
W. Bush.
Bush, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Israel doesn't need to see into anybody's soul. It needs to see the checkbook. It needs to see, whether you have power, whether you can do things that further Israel's interests. So, yeah, that's a long way of answering what you said, David.
Okay, I've got two, actually, I had two comments and a question, but I have a third comment because I'd go against David. This idea that Israel is an aircraft carrier for the US is a fantasy. And when you look at it, Israel has never supported the US foreign policy military objectives. If you go into Iraq or Afghanistan or the Ukraine now. Anyway, the two things I wanted the two comments is, one is you said you accept violence, and I think you can go past further than that. Most of the times when Israel has given up something or made a compromise, it was in response to violence. So you can make the argument that violence works. You can also make it that doesn't work, but you certainly can make an argument that violence works. The other thing, besides the next comment, you talked about the Israeli lobby sort of supporting Israel. The Israeli lobby is really worse than that, because right now AIPAC is supporting over 100 Republicans who voted against confirming Biden's election. So they've
also refused to endorse Cheney, who's pro-Israel, which is really interesting. They're basically captive of the Republican Party and Republican donors. They want to call themselves bipartisan, right? Bipartisan. Yeah, we have lots of Democrats, but that's, pardon my language, that's bullshit. They are a full subsidiary of the Republican Party. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. That would. So my question is, you said the settlers control the government in Israel, and the government is supposed to change in about a year to Lapid taking over from Bennett. And Lapid is more moderate to some extent. He's certainly more moderate than Bennett. So what's going to happen? How do you see the settlers reacting if in fact the government goes so Lapid actually does take charge?
This is a really interesting question because not you, I'm not directing this to you, Jeff, but a lot of American Jews feel, oh my God, well, if we could only get the Labor Party in power, or if we could only get something more moderate than Netanyahu in power, then everything would be good. And, let's hope in the next election that we can get a more moderate government. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's there. You're never going to get the kind of pragmatic, centrist leader who um, I mean, Ariel Sharon was the last political leader who had enough power and strength to 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 compel the Israeli political scene to engage in any kind of compromise. And he died in office. So it doesn't matter whether Lapid is in power or Bennett is in power or Netanyahu is in power. They're different, slightly different flavors of the same, vanilla ice cream. You add a little bit of something into each one and it's slightly different. But, when I said the settlers control the government, I didn't mean that they literally, I didn't mean that the chief settler is the prime minister, although you could maybe say that in Bennett's case. I meant to say that they have their network and their tenterhooks so deeply enmeshed in Israeli society and Israeli levers of control, political control, financial control, in so many different ways that they really are the dominant force in Israel, and they have been for decades, and they will continue to be until somebody knocks some sense into Israel, which is what we were talking about earlier. So I have no hope that any election is going to bring any a political leader to power who can engage in any change, because there is a very narrow, not consensus, but there's a very narrow strip of what's permissible and possible within Israeli politics. A Palestinian state, not possible. Um, what else can you think of? Settlements, getting rid of settlements, returning to 67 borders, not possible. So what is possible? Status quo. And by that, I don't mean that things will stay the same. I mean that they'll get worse because settlements will continue. They'll continue to send Israeli Jews to live in these settlements. They will continue stealing Palestinian land and resources. They will continue to ethnically cleanse Jerusalem. So there will be that incremental damage that will continue, but there will be no serious possibility of any real change.
Tony,
Yeah, I think I was going to ask a question about, don't all of those political leaders believe that there should be no Palestinian state, that it's all just Israel?
Well,
And it's just,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, Netanyahu certainly came out and said that. Naftali Bennett also came out, said that. And I think Lapid has come out and said it. And certainly the woman who did the Ukrainian $3,000 deal, she herself has been strongly, that this is it. I think it's going to get much, much worse before it gets better. And I think the ethnic cleansing is just going to continue. And I don't think that American politicians are going to have enough cojones, to use your wonderful phrase, to resist it. I think until you get rid of lobbying and political contributions through lobbying and PACs in the United States, you're not going to be able to get politicians who are going to be independent and make up their own mind and say, this is really terrible, we got to pull away from it.
Yeah, I think that Israeli politicians used to say that they support a two-state solution. There was even a moment, a brief moment, when I don't remember if it was Obama, forced Netanyahu to make a statement saying he supported a two-state solution, but I think he was throwing up on the background as he said it, and of course now he completely rejects a two-state solution. Lapid, who ostensibly supports a two-state solution, he's basically said, we're not going to talk about that. That's not going to be part of this government, not going to be part of the agenda, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is that you have Meretz and you have the Labor Party in the governing coalition all agreeing or conceding that there's no horizon for Palestine. So all of the Israeli political scene is compromised in that sense. There's no opposition in any real sense. You have the joint list, which is almost all Palestinian, Israeli-Palestinian, and they are a large party in the context of the Knesset, but they're very boxed in. They except for this small party that broke off from the joint list and does have a, I don't think they have a minister in the government, but anyway, they have no power. They are very constricted in terms of their impact. So the Israeli political scene is dismal in terms of any possibility of change.
Okay, David has his hand up, but Yossi and Jeff Cooper and Eric and Mohammed and Asim, we haven't heard from any of you. This is the first Zoom. This is a 40-second Zoom, and this is the first time Yossi hasn't had his hand up.
Well,
so-
I would like to ask a question.
No,
you provoked me to say
it's David's
something.
turn, but we'll come to you next.
Okay.
No, let Yossi go first if he hasn't gone yet. It's okay. No?
Okay,
Yossi.
you know, the reason I didn't say anything because we had this discussion so many times around this kind of understanding that things bad, United States supporting the Israeli government, the settlements expanding and all this. Okay, I got it. And I ask myself, what else I can say that you'd never heard before? Or something new to add? Maybe one thing I can say, you mentioned in your talk, Richard, that Israel isolated, and I want to really disagree with you. If you look at the Israeli government relationship with the world, they have relationship with most countries in the world. Even improve. Even now, the president of Israel, Herzog, went to Turkey to improve relationship between Israel and Turkey. Israel have a good business in China. They have business with Russia. They have business with India. The European Union, once in a while, they're criticizing the settlements and this, but the business with European Union is flourishing. And I don't have to say anything about United States because we all know that this is very, very stable relationship. When come to Russia and what's happening there, I don't know if you guys were, but the Israeli Air Force once a week, sometimes twice a week, is bombing Iranian forces or bases in Syria, and Russia gives them a free hand to do it. Not only giving them free hand, they prohibit from Syrian army to use the SA-300 anti-aircraft missiles as a request by Israel. And then you ask what Russia get in return is there are, you know, in many countries, when they want to have good relationship with most of the West, the gate is Jerusalem. I mean, West Jerusalem, I'm talking about. And Putin, he's not stupid man. He understands that good relationship with Israel, it's giving him some leverage, you know. So this is why the Israeli government refused to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, because of the special things they can do in Syria. This is really, it's all about, you know. And for the current Israeli government and previous Israeli government, Netanyahu, it's very important to go once a week to send the Air Force to violate the international airspace of Lebanon and Syria once a week, because many times the Israeli jet fighter go through the Lebanese airspace to bomb. and it just go. You never heard the Russia condemning this, you know. So this is one thing. So I think why I'm saying it, because it's very clear that a reverse of the Israeli policy, it's up to the international community. And when the international community don't have the will to do it, the Israeli government can do and continue to do whatever they do. And it's not just the United States. The powerful China and Russia, what they do about this, about the occupation? They only do a lip service, that's it. But the business is flourishing. China have a lot of business and infrastructures business in Israel. The only thing they have a small request, don't send the Chinese labors to the occupied territories. And in Israel, they're willing to swallow this. It's not a big deal because most of the infrastructure is happening inside Israel, you know. So they have very, very good relationships to business, weapons, and this, you know. One thing that maybe I can say that maybe most people here will disagree with me. Yossi still believe in concept of two states for this reason. I don't want to go to the argument if it's dead or not dead. This is not the issue. The point is that it's not changed. There are two strong national entities there. The Israeli Jews and the Palestinians. And this time of history, they are not ready to share one government and one country. They are not willing. Go try to convince Israeli Jews to give up their state. I think you will fail miserably. And I'm not talking about 60%, I'm talking about 95%, 98% of Israeli Jews. Now, why it's not happening? I put back the blame on the international community. They do a big fuss about occupation of Ukraine. They silent about the devastating war in Yemen. And they're willing to look the other side. And the reason is because Israel is one of us. This is what I mean. One of us is one of the Western country. And if you're one of us, we'll forgive you many things that you do. That's it, I'm done. Thank you.
Well, you raised some really big questions. I do disagree with you about two-state solution because most Israelis, whether they may say that they support a two-state solution, it doesn't really matter because they're not willing to support the changes and the compromises that would be necessary to create a two-state. And yes, most Israelis do not support one state. But I think if we wait till Israelis in a majority support any one solution or another, we'll wait until the Messiah comes, if then. So I think that the only way this is going to happen, whether it's two or one state, is through force, through power, through pressure, through economic suffering, economic cost. And that's the only way that this is going to happen. I think that there are examples in the world of countries where there have been huge levels of religious strife and political, minorities and majorities fighting with each other. Northern Ireland is one. Canada is a country that's based on, resolving the conflict and the power sharing between French Canada and the rest of the provinces. And South Africa, we can talk about that. It's not the greatest success story, but it is an example of a transformation from a white-dominated country to a black majority-dominated country. So I am not saying that it's going to be simple or that it's going to be quick. And I don't have a crystal ball to say that it will eventually happen, but I think that something like it has to happen. Unless you want to talk about Israel in 100 or 50 years actually self-destructing. Maybe it could go on like this for a long time into the future, but I think that it's a very unstable situation. And it reminds me a little bit of the Soviet Union. You know, it was a country that everyone thought would be there forever. And guess what? You know, within less than a year, it disintegrated. Um, so I'm not saying that's going to happen to Israel either. But now to go to your original point, which I think is also important, no doubt Israel has huge commercial and financial and trade relationships with many countries, and it's deepened those. Netanyahu, when he was prime minister, went to China. There's just huge levels of, and Israeli exports, arms exports, and the exports of spy technology. All of these types of things are exported from Israel and strengthen the Israeli economy. So there's no question that Israel has developed those kind of relationships. And once it has them, that those countries it trades with find it more difficult to take a moral position. That's all the more reason I think that we have to build a non-governmental mass movement, international mass movement that moves gradually these entities, these international bodies you mentioned, and governments that gradually will create more and more momentum in the direction of the ways that we're hoping that things will go. I'm not expecting success overnight. You know, I've been involved in this since 1967, so I'm hoping it's not another 50 years or 70 years, however long it was, before anything changes for the better. But I think that's the way to go right now.
Okay, David, and then Eric.
Okay, thanks. I raised my hand to talk about something and then other things come up, so I'll try to be quick. Richard, I basically agree with you about the two-state futility at this point. And another reason that is not often mentioned is that while I think a lot of Palestinians were willing to accept that what would have been a huge compromise of two states when it looked like it might have been a real sovereign state or something very close to it. It's so, that is so far from reality right now, both with the proliferation of the huge settlements and land takeovers and opinion in Israel, that I think Palestinians are just moving away from that, especially in light of the fact that huge compromise would have meant giving up to a large degree on the right of return. And I since the days decades ago when I was more of a liberal Zionist, though I would describe it as a left Zionist back then, and Dick knows what I mean. We worked together on that. I have come to appreciate much more than I did then the importance of the right of return to Palestinians, the emotional aspect of it, and the political aspect of it. If not the fact that plenty of Palestinians would not return even if they could, but the importance of recognizing that and supporting it, I think is much more much stronger than I realized, and I think that also mitigates now against the fast dropping support for two states that you see among the Palestinian public. I did put a little quick question in the chat, and I don't want to belabor this at all, but I'm curious. You can say either yes or no. But do you think that if Rabin had not been assassinated, he would have had a good chance of bringing the two states to fruition, which is what it's not, it's not in the Oslo Accords, but it's what a lot of people expected to happen as a result of the Oslo Accords. And finally, the question that I first wanted to ask when I raised my hand again, and I also put this in the chat, I don't know if you're following it, is you mentioned AIPAC being pretty much aligned with the Republican Party now. And that's obviously true. And I think what makes it easier for them to do that is they have Democratic majority for Israel to take care of the Democrats. And I'm just curious whether you have any juicy information on coordination between AIPAC and DMFI for working what is obviously their common purpose.
I don't have any direct information about that, but you can look at the MO, modus operandi of DFMI or whatever the initials are. They are really among the sleaziest of the sleazy. AIPAC is classy by comparison to DFMI because AIPAC will put the shiv in your back, behind your back and off screen. at DFMI, uh, just they they flood campaigns with millions of dollars. I think they put $1 million into Sanders, opposing Sanders in the Iowa caucuses, and similar things like that. And the language that they use is so smearing and so offensive and so ridiculous. And I don't see how it has any impact. I think maybe it's just sort of to humor the whoever's giving them the money that they're giving them. Maybe it's AIPAC itself or AIPAC donors. Um, but it's sort of like the Republican Jewish Coalition. You know, a lot of wealthy Jews get together and throw money at the Republican Party and try to turn Democrats into Republicans, and it never works. And they spend a lot of money doing it, and they're just spinning their wheels. So that's my opinion of DFMI in general. But in terms of Robin, I don't know. You know, he would have tried to create a two-state solution. Whether he would have succeeded, I don't know. He certainly would have done better than Shimon Peres, who really fucked it up, who became the prime minister after Rabin was assassinated. And Peres had a chance to follow in Rabin's footsteps, but Peres was a hawk, and Rabin, even though he was the chief of staff and said pretty horrible things about Palestinians, he was much more pragmatic, I think, than Peres. And Peres dithered instead of trying to follow up and really move the needle. He dithered, and then Hamas started bombing, and then he was dead, and Peres lost the next election. So, was there hope that Rabin would have done it? Yes, I think there was, and it's very interesting to me to talk about the assassination and the role that the assassination played in the political development in Israel. It was designed to cut off any chance of compromise with the Palestinians. And it was successful, obviously, in doing that. So I don't know if it was a plan of some genius plan of someone, settlers or whatever, political leaders, although Netanyahu himself took a huge advantage of this, and he made that, Mussolini-like speech in Kikar Zion in Jerusalem that whipped up fury in the crowd, and within 3 weeks, Rabin was dead. So whether it was an organized plan to assassinate him, or whether the outcome was just a corollary of the assassination that was not intended, that's the impact, that it totally shut off any possibility of compromise and destroyed any political will in Israel to go the direction that Rabin was going.
That's what assassinations are for.
Yeah.
Eric?
Yeah, well, my interest was piqued by the remarks about AIPAC. I also saw that recently online, something about them supporting Republicans who voted to keep or not to impeach Trump. And I didn't know about Liz Cheney, but that's more fuel for the fire. So my question is this: could this be the what do they slay the vampire with, a silver stake? Could this be the stake that kills AIPAC? Which supposedly is bipartisan, as you say, but is really, it turns out their true colors are Republican. But it's not only Republican, rich Republican Jews who are funding them, but also, you can't ignore the evangelical movement and the Christian Zionists. They're probably even more important than the Jews, actually, because they're far more numerous. And, they have this, almost inexplicable fascination with Jerusalem and Israel and the Bible, and so it seems to me that most Jewish Democrats would be amenable to hearing this message that that AIPAC is truly no longer bipartisan. It is really just a Republican pack, and with the right PR, the right guidance, the right language, the AIPAC could lose its legitimacy. And
Yeah.
the guiding philosophy behind this is something that we have encountered time and time again, not only in LA Jews for Peace, but in many of the progressive organizations and causes that that some of us are involved with. We really can't do much about in the international situation. In many cases, we can only be effective as American citizens in the United States. So, powerless really to affect much of what Israel does or says or believes or the way they behave or whatever. We can at least try to be effective here at home.
Well, my blog is an attempt to have some impact in Israel and on Israel, and it does. I'm not saying that I'm going to bring any major changes to Israel, but I'm trying to insert my views into the political atmosphere in Israel, and trying to expose the secrets and expose the excesses and crimes that Israel engages in, and that does have an impact. Violating military censorship to tell stories that are embarrassing to the intelligence apparatus or the military. That does sort of put a little crack in the system. And so I think we can have certain influence and impact. But like you said, I think it is limited, but I think we can have impact beyond our community, beyond LA, beyond, even beyond the Jewish community. But I do want to go back to a very interesting, important issue that you raised about the evangelicals. And I wanted to, in a broad context, talk about how the evangelicals have replaced American Jews. The Likud has decided over the last 10, 20 years, American Jews are hopeless. There are always going to be Democrats. The Democrats are always going to be the least supportive of Israel. They're always going to be the enemies of Israel or anti-Israel, whatever term you want to use. So we have to abandon American Jews. In addition, American Jews are assimilating, and there won't be American Jews, blah, blah, blah. That's the whole sort of right-wing Zionist narrative. So we need to replace American Jews because we can't have no allies in the United States. So the evangelicals are a natural alternative because, like you said, they believe in the messianic, whatever you want to call it, the coming of the Messiah, the end times, the ingathering, and the killing of the a third of the Jews, and the rest will accept Christ, etc. So the evangelical sort of thought system is very amenable to Israel, and they're getting the Israeli organizations and political entities are getting huge levels of support, both financial, political, from the evangelicals. I believe that this is I won't say foolish, but it's a really short-sighted relationship, just like I think the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. It's very short-sighted because I don't think that there are real shared values there. I think there are, like I said, transactional. This is a transactional relationship rather than a relationship that's based on mutual or shared values. And I think it's the same thing with the evangelicals. I don't think, I think there will come a time when the interests of both will diverge, and then Israel may be left, high and dry. No American Jews anymore, and no evangelicals. For now, of course, the evangelicals are solidly in the Israeli camp, but I don't see that as being viable in the long term.
Dick? Dick, you're muted.
Yeah. Two questions. Richard, could you kind of run through all the ways that you get your views out? Substack, email, listservs, YouTube, how people can sign up so they're part of, they're keeping up with all the things you're writing. That's the first
Thank you.
question.
Yeah.
The second question is one of the local columnists for the LA Times, Nicholas Goldberg, who used to be their correspondent, I believe, in Israel. And it used to come to some of the events of the Levantine Center that one of our members was active in, had a piece today in which he said the idea of managing this conflict is not sufficient either for morally or politically. And in this editorial ed-op piece in the LA Times, he said, we have to find a resolution. And he said, whether it's going to be a two-state or one-state solution. I think he even listed a few other alternatives. So is this some feeler, or you think it's just some guy who's a bit more progressive on Israel who found a way to squeak his views through in a mainstream press?
Well, I'm sympathetic with his point of view. I mean, there's all these mantras that pro-Israel has, and the U.S. also. So the U.S. says it's sending 2 State Department officials to Israel and Jordan and Palestine to calm tensions. They want to calm the unrest. I forget what term you said that Goldberg used.
You
There's
said
always
it's morally and politically unviable in the long run.
no, but I think that he said something like calm. They want calm. They want to ease the unrest. Like this is a time bomb. There's no
Well, I
calm.
think that was kind of his argument. It is a time bomb. I
Yeah,
was quite surprised by it. He kind of muffled his message, but it came through if you knew how to read between the lines.
yeah. With the LA Times, they probably have to be cautious in
Yeah.
terms of the politics. But yeah, I mean, this is not. There's no such thing as calm or soothing the tempers and easing tension. That's another one. Easing tension, calm. What this is a hand grenade that somebody has thrown. It's about to explode. Well, it is exploding already because people are dying. So to say calm or easing the unrest, those are tools that anesthetize people because they think if we can just create calm, then maybe we can get to something better, or maybe then people will be willing to compromise or negotiate or whatever. That's crap. Israel is buying the fact that there will be calm, that somebody will help them instill calm, so that they continue doing what they're doing already. That's all that they want to do. They don't want calm because then they can negotiate with the Palestinians, or then they can give the Palestinians what they deserve. So when I hear words like that, it just, it makes my, my hair stand on end, or whatever the phrase is. It just really annoys the crap out of me.
Now, what about your
Oh,
list,
yes,
blog,
yes. Yeah.
all the different ways that people
Thanks.
can
Thanks
keep
if I can toot my horn. So I have my blog, which is my URL is richardsilverstein.com. It's called Tikkun Olam. I publish at 3 or 4 publications. One is called Middle East Eye. The other is called The New Arab. Jacobin magazines, many of you may know, and then Al Jazeera English once in a while, they will publish something of mine. So those are the outlets that I generally publish at. You mentioned a podcast, but I was doing an interview for a
Oh,
podcast earlier today.
You have your own podcast. Okay.
Yeah, I've been thinking about a podcast, but it's pretty technically complicated and stuff. I'm not prepared to, spend the energy on it. But that's called Parallax View, and that'll be out. And you can, until Elon Musk shuts down my Twitter account, you can find me on Twitter and on Facebook, places like that as well.
And to subscribe to your blog then?
Yeah, so anybody who comes to Tikkun Olam, you can click on the, I think it's a subscribe button on the top, and you can get email notices whenever I publish a post, and it'll give you a link, and so you can just go directly to the post and read it. I usually publish, depending on how things are going, 3 times a week, sometimes 2 times a week. Um, but I'm always trying not to, when I first started doing my blog, was basically I would see a news article and then I would give my own commentary on it. But now what I try to do is I try to add something that isn't already there. And that's certainly what I'm doing when I'm publishing news, breaking news that's under military censorship, because nobody outside of Israel can publish this stuff. So that's what I do. But I'm also trying to break new ground intellectually, politically, going places where other people haven't yet gone, and sort of incrementally changing the debate. That's why, when I was talking earlier about talking about Israel as a terrorist state, apartheid state, um, these incrementally taking the debate in a direction I want it to go. So that's what the goal is of my blog.
Okay, thank you.
Uh, when the government changed about a year ago from Netanyahu to Bennett Lapid, there seem to be two changes that I see. One is that the life for Palestinians within the 67 border, within Israel's sensus stricto, seems to have improved. There's anecdotal evidence from uh, Jewish Arab groups that things are better. But it's also clear that in the West Bank, the settlers and the army have gotten much more violent and much more vicious against the Palestinians and the Jews and internationals that help them with olive harvests and stuff like that. Do you care to comment on that situation?
Well, I agree with you about the West Bank. I think that it's a disaster. The whole thing is a disaster. And what Israel is doing there is awful, and that's actually will be part of the ICC investigation, because Israeli conquest and retention of the occupied territories is a violation of international law. So the ICC has included that as part of their brief, which is good. I don't know if I agree with the first part of what you said, because think about last May. What happened? There were pogroms inside Israel. Israeli Palestinians were in fear of their lives. There were vigilante gangs running up and down the streets in Arab neighborhoods, trying to break into homes, beating senseless Israeli Palestinians on the street. And the Israeli gangs were sort of like Kahanist gangs, and they were using WhatsApp to organize their pogroms, just like they were in Myanmar, in Burma, against the Rohingya. So this is something I don't think that Israeli Palestinians are going to quickly forget. Um, I think in some sense you could say that the Ra'am party, the supposedly Islamist party that broke off from the joint list, they have 4 seats. I think David Mandel said in the chat that they do have a ministerial portfolio. So yeah, you could say that for the first time, Israeli Palestinians have a political party and a governing coalition. So, but to me, that's superficial. First of all, Ra'am is a transactional party. They're supposedly allied with the Islamic Brotherhood. How does the Islamic Brotherhood find its way into a far right Israeli coalition? It doesn't make any sense to me in political terms. But again, Israeli politics is not really based on values. It's more, and it's not based on ideology. It's based on transactions, on deals between people. So yeah, in that sense, maybe that's unprecedented, and everybody in Israel and Israel apologists in the U.S. Oh, look, Israel is truly democratic. They have an Arab party that's really in the Knesset in the governing coalition for the first time. Isn't that wonderful? The liberal democratic state of Israel, etc. So yeah, I think it's cosmetic, if anything, and I think Israeli Palestinians realize that their status is extremely tenuous in Israel.
Yossi?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on this. First, Richard, the event last May happened under Netanyahu, not under the new government.
Right.
So it's not be fair to say that this is part of Bennett policy. But one thing I agree with, in day-to-day life, everyday life, nothing really changed for the Palestinians or citizens of Israel. There is a lot of discussion about allocating money for infrastructures, for police, for security. But at this point, it's only in discussion. It's not something that's happening. However, to be fair, one thing did improve. During Netanyahu was unprecedented incitement against Arabs in Israel. And this incitement, at least from the government, stopped because Bennett, who established some kind of relationship with Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ram party, they agree that the incitement is not part of the discussions. But the incitement did not stop in the Israeli media, the Israeli TV, especially against the Bedouins. It's got even worse on this level, And if you ask the Bedouins, their life, it's got worse because of the government aggressive policy to destroy houses that they consider to be illegal in the 40 unrecognized villages, But at least some kind of a little bit better atmosphere in Israel that was during Netanyahu, with completely a barbaric incitement, he and all his lieutenants that were part of his government, So at least this one came down. But if you ask people who live in Al-Fahim, Nazareth, if their life have been changed, they will tell you nothing changed. In day-to-day life, If you want, I can give you example where is the ignorance of the Israeli ministers. If you take town of Al-Fahim, they allocated money for building a government housing, stories, many stories. And they came to the city council and the city council said, sorry, we don't have a public land. All the public land have been expropriated a long time ago. If you want us to build, if you want a place to build housing, you have to give us land. And the bureaucrats who came to realize, they said, wow, we didn't know this. We're not aware you don't have a public land because public land exists in every Jewish town, but not in Arab towns. Everything already have been taken away from them. Okay.
Yeah, so talking about Bennett, that's interesting too, because Bennett, before he became prime minister, was a right-wing firebrand, just like Netanyahu, and tried to position himself to Netanyahu's right. And he comes out of that sort of, he's not a settler, but he comes out of that settler model, whereas Netanyahu doesn't come out from that kind of milieu. But since he became prime minister, he's gotten religion, and he's a smoother politician than Netanyahu. I think he was trying to calm things to an extent. The problem is that he got mugged by reality. He had the 4 terror attacks, and he had to revert to what Netanyahu's policy, where send 5 or 10,000 troops in the West Bank, start arresting hundreds of people, trying to root out terrorism, in quotes. So he became like a little Netanyahu. I don't think that he probably wanted to do that. I think he wanted to maintain calm. He wants to keep Ahmed Mansour in that coalition if he can. Although, given the unrest happening now, Mansour basically suspended his participation in the coalition because he can't countenance what's happening on the Haram al Sharif. So yeah, I think that Bennett was trying to be a smoother. What did they say about a kinder, gentler conservatism? Bush said or something. I think he was trying to be a kinder, gentler version of Netanyahu. And I appreciate that, because what happened a year ago in Israel was civil war. It was just awful. It was this country completely disintegrating. So Bennett, at least I think, calmed things in a certain way. He didn't introduce anything helpful or constructive or long term, but he just calmed the waters. There's something a little bit to be said for that.
Okay, with that, and it's approaching 2 hours, I'd like to thank Richard for everybody. And I'm going to take just 1 second to remind you of what's coming up in 3 weeks. On Monday night, we have Jeff Cooper on Occupation is Terrorism. And 3 weeks beyond that, on June 6th, we have an analysis of the nuclear deal, however it sits out at that point. With that, if no one has anything else, I'd like to thank Richard again. And see
Thank you,
guys.
Jeff. And thank you, Dick. And thank you to your group. And I appreciate the chance to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Richard.
Bye,
All
everybody.
right. Take care.
See you next,
Bye.
Jeff.
Take care, Tony.
I will.
Thanks. Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody else.
Sure.